My name is Dr. Aragam. Nice to have you here. This is our first of hopefully many of our kind of informal expert series. And today I have with me, for Sense of Self, Dr. Rupi Legha, who is now a kind of old dear friend of mine. I feel like enough years have passed where I can call you an old friend. And Rupi is a child and adolescent psychiatrist based in Los Angeles. She's the founder of the Anti-Racism and Mental Health Fellowship, which is really wonderful. Please check it out. And she has an extensive work in kind of deconstructing and understanding the culture of kind of toxicity and racism that exists within the training for medical residents, and has written extensively about it as well, and sort of has kind of a call to action on how we can really change the system. So for that reason and many others, I invited her to be kind of our inaugural expert as we discuss the themes of sense of self. So Ruby, welcome. And I'm so happy and honored to have you here. So please add whatever you want to my introduction so people get to know you.
Yeah, thrilled to be here with you, Dr. Gowrie Aragam. And I was going to say I'm Dr. Rupi Legha, Dr. Legha if you're nasty. I'm just kidding. As a testament to my undoing of my medical training and professionalization, I insert humor into anything, including the most serious and important of topics like the one we're looking at today.
Yes, and I think you and I are alike in that, which is why you're the perfect first guest. Today, we are here to discuss an episode from Sense of Self. And the theme of today is, what does it take to step away, in parentheses, from something you've trained for your entire life and demand your own healing? And so this is a topic that you and I kind of discussed together and decided it would be a really important thing to talk about, and have now dedicated a lot of your life to. I would love if you could just share with us what you shared with me, which was your reactions to Shay's story, why you feel like it's resonated with so many people in medical training who have independently reached out to me and my team, letting us know that they felt as though Shay's kind of depiction of training was so spot on, and they were so thankful for her kind of be putting words to it, something they kind of had not felt like they could for a long time. So yeah, I'll pass it over to you as to kind of why you feel like it's resonating so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think Shay's episode was such a beautiful and honest and raw depiction of a story that so many of us relate to, but have never really seen put out in public. And so, post 2020, post racial reckoning in this country, medicine as a profession has done some work on racism and anti-racism. There's been a lot of movement to uncover scientific racism in standard clinical practices. There are more papers coming up about different racial health inequities. And we also see that, there's a more of a look at the amount of discrimination in medical training and professionalization, things of that nature. And yet the stories of the lives behind it, I don't think are out there. And I think for those of us who are interested in this topic and who care about this issue, will often have stories brought to us like touch points, little vignettes of experiences because somebody needs help and there's no help to be found through the existing structures. And then Shay's story comes and puts it all so beautifully together in such a layered way. Family, health and well-being, professional training, multiple different institutions. And so I think it's just such a vivid portrait of an experience that many of us feel viscerally, but have not seen plainly in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, even in like the responses I was getting, I could tell it was such a visceral response that people were having, because even they still didn't have the words for it, but they just knew that something about it felt very freeing. Because, she talks about a lot of themes that I know you have talked about a lot in your teaching, in your writing, when it comes to what people face in training specifically, that doesn't get talked about, as you just said, but also isn't really even, I think the person going through it isn't even aware of it, right? I think Shay discusses how so much of this was just the water she was swimming in. She had no sense of the fact that there was anything kind of quote unquote wrong with the system or the way she was being treated. It all became very personal. She felt like it was just her. She was the issue.
Yep.
Full stop. You've talked to so many, you have patients, you have kind of residents that you mentor. I'm just curious, like, I'm sure that topic is that the issue has come up a lot for you. And I'm just wondering kind of how it's come up and kind of how you start to approach it with people that you know.
Yeah, what immediately comes to mind is suicide. And I think why that jumps out is because, of course, among physicians, the rates of suicide are incredibly high, among the highest of professionals. And then the rates of depression in medical students and residents are also quite sky high. And I think instead of looking at those as individual problems, they're really signaling that there's something terribly wrong with our training and professionalization processes. And I think one element of that is really feeling completely alone and isolated when it's happening, because in that moment, all of the various structural and interpersonal issues are completely reconfigured as the shortcomings of one person. And
Yeah.
everyone around you has bought into the delusion. I mean, she describes like a lot of bullying and even, mobbing behavior, toxic workplace phenomena. And yes, so I think the thing that stands out to me is just the ways that any one person can feel so low and degraded about themselves. And so much so that I think people often get quite suicidal in that context.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's so timely to talk about. I think it's always timely to talk about this because I think there's so much assumption around what can lead to someone feeling that way about their life, right? And but what we're getting at here is one of the avenues to that is an avenue where, like you said, when you're kind of surrounded by people and policies and ways of doing things that just continue to reaffirm your lack of worth or ability, you start to believe it too, right? And when that's the case, it's like, well, what other option is there, right? We often talk about how, when you're trying to when your mind is trying to solve a problem, it kind of tries to come up with what makes the most sense to it as a solution, given its state at the time. And sometimes when you're kind of in that state and all of these negative things about you are being reinforced, that ends up being the solution that your mind comes up with, right? And it feels very real and very kind of it feels like the solution, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's very hard for people to fully understand because, like you said, so many of us, me included, are kind of in the system, and so we sort of just we don't see it clearly. And I think in Shay's story, I think something you and I have talked about a lot too is when you start to notice and when you start to realize that also can be there's not even a word intense enough to describe this, but it can be like a total kind of mind, right? Like it can just be like, what is real? What is not real? What have I kind of put myself into? What have I been subjected to for all these years? Holy crap, how do I get out of it? How do I do better? Right. Because I just came into this thinking I wanted to like help people or whatever. I enjoyed science, whatever it is. And now I'm kind of opening my eyes to the reality of how I'm being treated and how people are treated. And it can really throw a lot of people for a loop in a really bad way. Which to me is like it's another avenue for kind of feeling sort of helpless and alone. Again, this theme of like loneliness. And I'm just curious, like, I know you've experienced that. We've talked about how you've experienced that. I've experienced that. Shay experienced it in her story. But what do you feel like people don't really fully get or understand about kind of that tumult, like that people go through when the curtains kind of open and they sort of see what's behind the curtain?
Yeah, the term gets thrown around too casually, but truly how traumatizing it is. I think people think about medicine becoming a doctor or other healthcare provider, and the term care is within it, and so there's an assumption that it's caring. But what's really lost is just how brutal the training can be, and also how brutal the practice is. And so many of us are finding ourselves doing things that we do not want to do, that we think are morally reprehensible and wrong, and yet it's the way that things are done and the standard that we're held to. Um, and so, yeah, I think people lose how traumatizing it is, and part of that is because the profession has so much prestige and value. So, typically when one person becomes a doctor, it's not about just them. There's
Yeah.
been huge familial investment and sacrifice. There's a lot
Yeah.
of bravado, reputation, and bragging around it. So to say that you dropped out of a residency program or a medical school or left the profession, regardless of what's on the other side of it, there's so much stigma and shame related to that and judgment.
Mhm.
And I think Shay's story is very inspiring liberation. Look at what she did, saying no thank you or goodbye to this nonsense. And yeah, just the way in which she freed herself after such a painful experience.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people going through that, right, might think, well, I don't necessarily want to leave medicine per se, right? But in her case, that ended up feeling like what was most life-saving, right? Truly. And because this is something about kind of what it takes to step away from something you've trained your whole life for and demand healing, right? To you, when you heard that, like, I don't know, like, how would you even answer that question, right? I mean, it's a really big question to answer, so I'm not asking you for like a thesis on this by any means. But like, whether it's Shay, whether it's someone else, whether it's medicine or something else, um, why do you feel like it's so difficult to do that beyond just the obvious answer?
To leave.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at it from a couple of perspectives. I definitely feel like there's an assimilation, de-assimilation process. So, the assimilation is the idea that you start to bend to fit to a professional mold and ideals. And, medicine is as demanding as it gets in terms of what that assimilative process is. But then to start to question it critically and step outside of it is a very active de-assimilation process. And so, you're kind of working your way out of it. So to have to undo the training and the programming that you've had to clear your vision and see things clearly, it's incredibly demanding emotionally, cognitively. It also completely disrupts your social circle because the people that you were friends or colleagues with whom to some degree there was a shared vision or a shared experience of some kind, that starts to go away. And so people find themselves incredibly and unbearably alone. And obviously, we are social creatures who are meant to connect.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I think the assimilation, de-assimilation, and then the absolute alienation from the person to your left and to your right that maybe you were once close to.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with that, right? I think it's clear from her story, I think clear from just people that we know, our own experiences, right? Where I think what is like so important to highlight there is what you said, right? The assimilation process can be so passive. That is it can just become what is, right? Without even realizing it. Whereas to get away from that, there's zero way that can be passive. There's no option for that. And when anything is active, when you have to like literally pause and be like, what's happening here? Why is that person saying that to me? What could be the bigger context, right? Like, what was their day like? What was their training like? Right? Did I actually make a mistake? What did I actually do that was wrong? Right? And to it can feel like you're overanalyzing a situation when actually you're just trying to see the truth of what's happening. And I can imagine that deters a lot of people because it's like, oh, I'm making a big deal of this, or like I'm trying to justify something. You know what I mean? It just ends up feeling like you're just doing too much, right? To understand something, which is oftentimes can be a huge deterrent. And to maintain that with every interaction, with every kind of experience you have, and more importantly, to also kind of like face yourself, because I think something that is less of a fun topic to talk about, I mean, not that we're talking about a fun topic right now, is that, you know, there can often be a lot of like system blaming, right? Which absolutely is deserved. But I think the proportion, like it can get out of proportion where it's like, oh, wait, there's also a reckoning you have to come to with yourself, which I think Shay talks about, which is like, what am I, how have I grown up? What am I bringing to this where how I am is only enabling this and fueling this, right? Which is not a fun thing to say because oftentimes it's like, there can be like a system blaming thing, and it can be easier to do that as well, right? But what you're talking about is, wait, that's easy too. It's easy to just point the finger elsewhere, but pointing the finger elsewhere and also at yourself is where the work stands. And that's sort of, I think, what I know I heard in Shay's story, where she talks about all of like the just even being in therapy and kind of what that required, being able to engage with her family, what that required. And I hear that not just in her story, but in other stories that I've heard from patients where many of them feel like they don't have the energy to do it, or the bandwidth, or just the privilege, honestly, to and the time to be able to do that. Because as you saw with her story, it can take a lot out of you. Not necessarily, but it really can. So I don't know. I just kind of went on a little like tangent, not tangent, but reflection there. I'm just curious kind of how, yeah, your thoughts on what I just said and kind of how you've seen it.
Yeah, in listening to you, what came to mind is just how annihilating it can be, how exhausting, and lest we forget, as much privilege and prestige and authority as doctors hold, coming out of medical school, with as much debt as most graduates are, and definitely for the medical students that I know, or the people who make it to residency after a leave or departure of some kind during medical school, to lose access to health insurance benefits, to lose access to many of the things that people need, their loans, to get by. And then in residency, to leave, what's the alternative when this is what you've been preparing for all your life? So, the financial concerns, the access to health insurance, the benefits, leaving and saying goodbye to those things adds, just another layer of burden.
Totally, right. And I think especially for, if you think of like women specifically, right, sort of why, let alone like a woman of color, a Black woman, like what is the implications of that, let alone kind of the just cognitive load of it all, kind of while you're in it and once you leave, because if you got to pay back loans that are inordinate, who has time to be going to therapy and thinking about, how to extricate themselves from this, like, colonial system? It doesn't come up as like a priority when you're in the midst of paying back loans, establishing your life, establishing your career, going into a competitive kind of professional life that is a continuation of that same culture you were in, and in some ways more baked in, right? In terms of what's expected of you and the politics that it requires to sort of get ahead. And just the day-to-day conversations and behavior. So yeah, I don't mean to like be de-incentivizing people from going for this, right? I just think it's really important. As we were talking about, it just feels very important to also highlight how the work that it does take. Because if nothing else, even if one person hears this and they're just like, oh, I'm not making too big of a deal of this. Oh, like it actually does require all this energy. It's not just me. This is just what the situation requires. That in itself can be a motivating force, right? To sort of normalize like what it takes to be able to do that. Whether you're trying to leave something or just change the circumstance,
Yeah.
and just do it differently.
Right. I mean, honestly, like this question of leaving or whether or not you should go into it in the first place, for me, I no longer encourage people to go to medical school. I'm a
Mm,
child psychiatrist.
yeah.
I'm a mandated reporter. When I see abuse happening, I'm required to do something about it. And if I think about people going into the profession not knowing what it's about, not their families not knowing the risk of abuse and mistreatment during training, or depression and suicide.
Yeah.
Um, a couple of years ago, I wrote a love letter to the graduating medical school class of 2023, outlining the risks of physician suicide as
I
occupational
remember that. Yeah.
hazard. Yeah. And so, on what planet am I going to encourage people to go into something that carries that occupational hazard? And I think, there's some responsibility to sort of play with this idea of trying to keep people in the profession. There are times when I say to myself, and I think this is partly why I connected to Shay's story so much, is that I've really wondered whether it would have been braver for me to leave and never come back, because it would have said something about what I was willing to tolerate from the profession and my self-worth, and what I wasn't. And I'm hearing it now, and that's for a reason. But I think that's something that's worth questioning, about whether or not we continue to encourage people to go into this profession, and whether we encourage people to stay. It could be a very powerful thing for a medical school class during a white coat ceremony to stand up and walk out, and say no more to something.
Yeah. And I think what is, even just thinking about that is just like, what would that take, right? That's a whole different conversation as to what that would take. But I think what's so tough is like when you say no more, so many times the people that you hope receive that message are like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Like they themselves don't know. I mean, how often do we feel like I remember in residency being pulled aside by a residency director being like, why is the younger class so and so? Why are they demanding X, Y, or Z? And I'm like, because we should have and we didn't. And they just now realize that they should and they can, and it's seems like I don't know, a nice way to treat people, like a fair and just way to treat people. Um, and this idea of, oh, they're being too soft or they're asking for too much. And sure, yes, in the world, there are always people who want to take advantage of anything. Like that is absolutely the case. We know people like that, like who want to just, take the easy road or whatever that even means, right? Um, but but for the most part, right, if you're someone who's trying to kind of get by and take care of yourself, like there has to be some discernment between when someone's actually like asking for something that is reasonable and equitable and just and fair treatment versus kind of whatever it is that always thinking the worst, which is I think what a lot of people in leadership do think, right? And so the first thing that came to mind when you said that is like I can't even imagine the people receiving that message understanding what the message even is, without like being slapped, like kind of hit in the face with it. Which is, I remember some people being like, I wish I had named names, like pointed out specific behavior and named a name so that there was more there was just it brought life to the story and people could really kind of understand like, oh, like in Shay's story, right? It's like so and so calling her out for making a mistake, telling her she was lying.
Right.
Oh, I feel like I've seen that happen. And in my case, I'm like, oh, what were they lying? I guess they were lying. Why would you ever question that? Right. And the person who said it, we don't know whether or not they would think, even to this day, that that was an issue. Right. Maybe they really hold steadfast to their perspective on what happened. And so I think, if nothing else, right, this idea of a love letter, not encouraging them, let alone kind of being like, well, at least let me educate you around what the potential is for harm and for that occupational hazard you were talking about. And then with open eyes, you can now make this decision and, kind of know where your boundary is, know what you're willing to put up with versus not put up with. Um, and it oftentimes takes people kind of with that ability and with even maybe that privilege, right, of like whether it's having a backstop, whether it's having other skills, whatever it is, to be able to do that. Because like you said, there's a lot riding on it too. It's not usually just the individual. There's often a lot riding on it kind of within the family system, um, as well, whether that's financial, let alone like reputational and all that, right? I think what's on my mind and something we talked about is how this idea of leaving something you've trained for. That's not just medicine, right? We saw an example of that kind of in the very public eye 4 years ago when Simone Biles, one of our favorite gymnasts, had the twisties during her vault. I've watched that video many times and kind of the breakdown of kind of what she must have been experiencing while high up in the air and how she had to make the decision to kind of remove herself from competition. And I think what really adds to this conversation now is that was in such the public eye, and we got to see just like the various responses people had to that, which I think only serves to strengthen this the points we're making in this conversation, where there are so many saying that she was powerful and brave, with just as many, if not more, saying that she was weak and betraying her country.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Like, what do we make of that, right? Like,
yeah, one perspective indicts an individual and leaves a system or structure unquestioned, and then the other does the opposite and
yeah,
celebrates the individual while holding accountable the surrounding structures and institutions. And I think there's the time lapse, right? There's the take on it when it happened, and then there's the take on it. What would we call what happened this past summer? Like redemption doesn't, I mean, it was just what she did was just magical. And her sovereignty with her decision making and the way in which she left and came back was so on her own terms, and then resonated with so many of us, similar to Shay's story. I mean, Shay's story was so clearly her own and touched so many of us. And I think Simone Biles, whether it's gymnastics or medicine, there's a parallel here.
yeah. And I think I know what struck me about that as well, and is you know in Simone Biles' story, she I think knew that her position as someone who was kind of top of her game, continues to be top of her game and the game of gymnastics, right? Um, was in a position both to carry the team to winning, which meant a lot to like the whole country, but also was in a position to step away and stick by her decision. Because I think there is a element of power and kind of influence, a huge power, sorry, element of power and influence that she carried, which I think is also very relevant. Um, because I'm sure others, which I'm hoping kind of empowers others who may not have that same power that she has in the space to be able to claim that for themselves. And I mean, there's another episode in the podcast that discusses kind of the culture of gymnastics specifically, which we won't get into now, but I think the how important that is, because for her it's like not only taking her health and safety kind of into consideration and making that a priority, but in the move that she did, she's actually making everybody else's health and priority
Yes.
I'm sorry, health and safety a priority as well
Yeah.
by leading by example, because she has that, stature. And I think, wow, right? And I think the parallel there is kind of what you were saying, even within medicine, is like, what would the parallel be, right? To someone being able to set an example in that way and not equivocate.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's the demanding that we're talking about. Like therein lies the demand when you don't equivocate, which is inspiring to me. I'm sure it was very inspiring to you as well, right?
Yeah, I mean it's sort of it's a futuristic professional code for us all to aspire to have enough sense of self, as it were, to make the call, to care for oneself. I mean, especially as a doctor, to choose yourself, what could be better for the people that you're providing care for, to model. But yeah, it's for me, it's a really astonishing version of professionalism. And maybe I would say, melanated womanist professionalism in particular, because for so many of us who feel pushed out, attacked, zeroed in on, under the spotlight, degraded and dehumanized, what does it mean when you stand up to that, and say, I'm going with me, the person who's been here with me all along.
Yeah. And I think, with absolutely right. And having a sense of self, having a self-worth, because in that case, right? Like I think what she's stating very clearly is I love what I'm doing. I love gymnastics, but I don't want to die because of this, because I'm doing it for somebody else. As much as I love it, nothing is worth dying for. And given what was happening to her, like that was, she could have ended up, either dead or just chronically injured, right? Like permanently injured. Which is, I think, something people just minimize so much so. Also telling, right? It's like this idea of no, 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 just push yourself to the limit. When you get hurt, we'll deal with it then.
Right. Right.
Or kind of be like, oh, feign surprise. Or maybe not even feign because you're so kind of delusional about the risk of what you're putting someone through that when they do get hurt, it's like, what do you mean they got hurt? Right? Which is enraging because the damage has already been done.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I think about the number of GoFundMe's and Twitter memorials that I've seen for residents who die by suicide, and it's egregious to me. Like, how are you raising money for funerals? How are you, how are you getting tens of thousands of likes and retweets? How is that the thing that we're doing after the tragedy has already happened, instead of seeing it coming at somebody like like a train? And so, yeah, I think thinking about that, something else that comes to mind is, you know, serving as a role model. I mean, I think of, Shay, Simone Biles in these settings, and just trying to get by and do what they need to do. But look at what an example it has set for so many people, maybe in ways that we don't fully understand or appreciate. And just knowing the ways in which, from the Netflix documentary that came out, like seeing the ways in which it's influenced her teammates and her team members, and
mhm.
some of the reparative experiences and gymnastics that they've had,
Yeah.
through her. um, yeah, I have that hope. I have that mandate and imperative for medicine as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like very glad and um grateful to have someone like you sort of in that position to be educating kind of the future. And again, like I'll just plug your fellowship because I think anybody who does it will be very grateful to have done it because it doesn't apply just to medicine, it applies to life, right? This is not something yeah, it applies to life. And so I think like we talked about, just even starting with your own education can do so much for how you show up for others. But I guess plugging your fellowship aside, I'll keep doing that because I'm Rupi Legha MD. No, but but I think like the thing I often hear, right, which is so true. Well, before I get to that, I'll say with Simone Biles, right? I think what's also telling is that she didn't just leave gymnastics, right? She left this competition. She left competitive gymnastics for a second because that was what was going to be potentially life-threatening to her. And like as much as it can seem obvious that someone would want to maintain their life, how can you maintain your life when you don't even know what the risks to your life are, right? You don't even know or you're aware of it because you're being pressured to do something that actually is risking you and your safety, but you've been told that it's not, right? And so kind of being gaslit in its own way into believing that what you're doing is actually for the greater good. When it's like, well, maybe, but not in this way, right? And I think what we talked about is her coming back to gymnastics, showcasing like, I'm not trying to leave. I just need to leave then. You know what I mean? Which is, of course, different than Shay's story, but very similar to, I think, what a lot of people might feel, which is like, oh, wait, it doesn't have to be a permanent departure, right? There's a reckoning, there's fallout for sure. But at the end of the day, like, there is a path to like survival and thriving. Which I think is for good reason not super clear to most people because it is kind of based on each individual and kind of what they have in their life as a support system within themselves, let alone others, right? But I think that also to me, that trajectory, I think is really lovely to see because she did come back. And then I think the Hollywood redemption story is that she also happened to win gold, So I think that just kind of for this particular story made it that much more palatable to people. But even if she hadn't won gold, right? She still came back to gymnastics. That in of itself to compete at that level is still very much a huge part of the story, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Agreed.
Well, I know that like specifically, not to, I just kind of like shared my own perspective on it, but I guess I share that because I'm just curious for you. I know prior to having this conversation, I talked about what do you think it took? We don't know her, but like, what do you, as Dr. Legha, the psychiatrist, the child psychiatrist, knowing someone who's done this kind of throughout their childhood now into their adulthood, kind of taking on this leadership position, like, what do you think that must have been like for someone like her, kind of in the in between time?
Oh man, and again, this is all is it speculation or is it just deep appreciation and admiration
Yeah,
from
exactly, right.
the glimpses of storytelling that I've gotten from interviews, social media,
Yeah.
and the Netflix documentary. But I think like to see the restoration of fun and play in
Mhm.
gymnastics, like when she left, it seems there wasn't a game plan to return and she left.
Yeah.
And then to watch the ways in which she reengaged, showing up at the gym with different people and, kind of bouncing around here and there. And I
Yeah.
think for the first year, like not really going close to it. And so, thinking about some of the things that she had been through in her childhood that she's spoken openly about, it just makes me think of wow, what grit and what heart and what spirit to be able to do that. And then I think to move through such a grueling professionalization process. So we see that in gymnastics at that, elite level, and then medical training to become a doctor. I mean, it really is grueling and brutal on
Yeah.
your body and your spirit. And so I think to see her love and compassion and care and concern for the people around her, I think it's just, you know, there's the strength of her physical prowess, but just, the strength and enormity of her heart and spirit. To me, that leaves a longer lasting impression.
Absolutely. Right. To me as well, which is why I was like, it wouldn't have mattered to me whether she won or not. Because I think just seeing how she moved through that. And I think also the scale of time, right? Because it's not like, oh, she just kind of stepped away for a week, a month, couple months. It was like, and I think the full year of stepping away, imagine what that must have felt like for someone, right? Whether it's her or anybody else, like the day to day, the ups and downs, questioning like what your future holds, if you made the right decision. This is not something that's going to feel good in the aftermath for quite some time. And so I think I say that because I also want to like normalize for anybody who is going through something like this or who is looking into it that don't be surprised if you don't feel better within a week or a month, right? Or things aren't clear to you. And then even Shay kind of mentioned that too, right? Which is like it takes time um to be able to kind of make your way through all the stages of grief, of questioning yourself, questioning the world, wondering what comes next, right? Kind of experimenting. And I think whether even in Shay's story, I think this idea of fun and joy, and even like in my own therapy, like when I'm with my therapist or when I'm with anybody who does any kind of healing work, the core to any kind of like rebuilding is to reconnect with things that bring you that sense of playfulness and joy, even if it's like getting an ice cream cone, you know, or like reading a book in the sunshine, like anything that brings you a sense of playfulness and joy are the building blocks to being able to like, and faith. I think faith, not like religious faith, but just faith in yourself and things unveiling themselves in time, which I think is really hard to maintain. But I think to your point, I don't know, to me that felt very inspiring because it's like, wow, you didn't just, you took the time it requires to rebuild, I guess, which I think is humbling, and heartening.
Yeah, I think our value is predicated upon what we do, not who we are. And
Yeah.
something that comes up in my work with people of all ages is, it's who you are, not what you do,
Yeah.
who I am, not what I do. And instead of the accolades and the degrees and the titles, like, what is the essence of you and how does it find full self-expression each day? Is it humor or fashion or hot pink or puppies or kids, whatever that essence of you is that cannot be taken away or measured based on what you do, but it's just who you are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's like that's something I feel like even for me, like it's something I'm exploring every day, right?
Yeah.
Always recalibrating and kind of even checking myself to make sure that I'm not veering too far off. And I think that's another blessing of having, close friends or family that also kind of want to see you be you, because it just provides another pair of eyes, even, right? To kind of keep motivating you and to provide that reflection, which I think is can also be very helpful. Not totally necessary necessarily, right? But definitely makes the journey a lot more palatable, and tolerable. Um, and I guess I also want to ask you because this idea of sense of self, right? It's the topic of the podcast, and is kind of the essence of the themes of all these conversations I will be having and am having. And for you, I think when you one of the like tenets of the podcast or themes of the podcast, which isn't, I guess, openly stated in any of the materials, but that we as a team hold dear is that like the liberation of an individual can lead to the liberation of a community. And I have my thoughts on what that means, but I think it's sort of like the core of why we did this podcast and what we feel to be true, what we hope to kind of showcase and encourage kind of step by step with each episode, with each story. I'm just curious, sort of like when I say that, what that means to you.
Oh gosh, no, I think that's perfectly said, and I was nodding my head and agree. And we can say it in different ways.
Yeah.
one of us can't be free until all of us are free, and my liberation is tied up in yours. And justice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And yeah, I mean, it completely resonates. So much so now that, in this stage of my life, as I think about the things that are transformative for people whose lives I'm involved in, I can see elements of how my own story and struggles and triumphs uh, really prepared us to show up in one another's lives in a given moment to engage in that process.
Yeah. And I think like it's interesting because I know when people hear whatever way you want to say that around liberation, right? It's like, again, if I think it's hard for many, including myself, at times to fully kind of wrap my head around what that means and what that looks like, even as for an individual, right? And it sounds like, I think each person can say it differently, which I think is the beauty of it as well, because everyone's going to understand it a little bit differently. Um, but in our conversation, right, just whatever it means to kind of value who you are over what you do or what you surround yourself with, like that to me can be the liberation that we need, right? That's freedom. It's just freedom to be yourself, whatever that means. Um, while also kind of, I think, having the freedom to treat others well, and like the old adage of treat others the way you actually want to be treated, not the way you think that you have to be, right? Or that you're worthy of. And therein lies the nuance, right? Because I think so much of this is tied up in self-worth, and how we think about ourselves is how we end up treating ourselves and how we end up treating others, whether we realize it or not. And I think being able to not undo all of that a little bit and like loosen up that knot and kind of be like, oh wait, no, actually I have worth. I'll treat myself with worth. I'll treat somebody else with worth. And that sort of just kind of builds on itself. Imagine imagine the possibilities. But I mean, I know you've already, I'm sure, seen in kind of your own personal life and being able to do that and kind of, we didn't talk about this in depth in this conversation, but in your own decision, right? To take this path that you're taking and to leave the job that you're in and to do what you're doing now. Like you
Yes.
liberated yourself in your own way.
Yes, and I continue to feel the ripples of that across generations,
Mm-hmm.
family, biological and otherwise, and in particular, in working with kids, I feel like I mean, there's the doctor side of things, child psychiatry side of things, but I often feel like the most important thing is, with a child who's in my life, who's bringing so much to me as well, I am some kind of wonderfully human, flawed example of someone who is living a life that she loves and has chosen to be with you and wants to be there. And is reckoning and wrestling with this world and all the problems that it has given us, and trying to take some responsibility for doing something about it. I think for kids and also for adults to be with another human being who's engaged in that effort, I think there's a very powerful exchange that happens there.
Totally. I mean, I just think about how often you see, I mean, I don't work with kids anymore, but I used to, and just let alone like, your own siblings and family members, right? But like, and remember from my own experience, it's like, oh yeah, like it can be really hard to feel like you can listen to an adult when it's so clear to a child, because children see and take in everything, when it can be so clear that that adult is not practicing what they preach, is not making any effort to better themselves, is sort of just pointing fingers. And children feel the injustice of that, even if they don't have the words for it. And it can come out in so many different ways. And so I think, yeah, like this idea of liberation, it's not just with our peers, it's with, yeah, it's multi-generational. That is in and of itself a whole other conversation that I am excited to have with you, hopefully at some point, if you'd like. But again, also, yeah, is like the core to why we've kind of um embarked upon this project of sense of self. So I don't know, any last thoughts or anything else you want to bring up, or any questions you have for me? It's okay if you don't, but just want to give you the floor to reflect or share anything
Yeah,
before we end.
yeah, sense of self is such it's so important. I mean, the idea of storytelling and what a huge impact it can have on us. And the stories that, have been a part of the series are remarkable. Yeah, I guess what motivated you or inspired you to make this happen and to create this?
Oh gosh, that is a big question and one I've been reckoning with myself recently because to be very honest, it was a very long process. It was in ideation for years, honestly, and I think really took there was an uptick in the motivation sort of in 2020 after COVID, after the murder of George Floyd. And I think there was this deep desire in me to just build empathy and understanding of other people's circumstances and situations that I felt like was glaringly missing. And I think you and I were working in an emergency room at the time, and we were seeing that happening every day just with our patients, and all kinds of prejudice and bigotry and racism that they experienced, whether it was because they were psychotic, because they were Black, because they were, female, because they were destitute, whatever the identifier was, we saw that happening day to day. And it just was boiling in me that what would it take to build empathy? And I think in thinking about it, I was like, well, so many of the stories we hear as psychiatrists are so similar in terms of like the human experience and condition. And most people have no idea of their own context, let alone the context of somebody else. And it's sometimes, what if we could expose people to not just the theory behind, oh, identity and narrative and how you feel about yourself, but kind of like the lived experience and first person story of someone who is actively in the process of better trying to understand themselves and in doing so better able to understand other humans. um and it was an experiment. We're like, what would this be like to do that? And I think that's what motivated me to kind of continue with it. And I think specifically around why we chose women of color as our focal point. I mean, you can start with what you know, first of all. Yeah. But also because, like it's about time to feature these stories because at the end of the day, like on the social hierarchy of who has power, women of color, and I can't even include us fully in this because we're children of immigrants and we have some social stature within, we're light-skinned children of immigrants who have social stature within the women of color demographic or but these are stories that are and experiences that are usually just pushed aside and dismissed from and it was just felt really important for me to be able to highlight those stories and give them a platform because at the end of the day, like the number of older white men who've been like, we love these episodes and like we relate with these topics too. It's not just women of color. Can't you feature me? And I'm like, it's like, how do you respond to that, right? But I think that's beautiful because that was the point. Like these experiences are universal, fully universal. Anyone can relate to them. We just happen to feature women of color because their stories deserve to be highlighted finally, with care. So yeah, that is the off the cuff answer to your question. Thank you for asking it.
So welcome.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think thanks everybody who listened to any of this. It was so fun to have you on, Rupi, Dr. Legha. And hopefully you'll, join us again as we hope the series continues. And to everyone else listening, stay tuned for any news about season 2 that is in the works, and we'll keep you updated as we know more. So thank you again and have a great day.
Awesome. Can I add one more thing in?
Yeah, obviously. This is so formal.
Would love for people to stay connected. And I'm on IG, Twitter, and LinkedIn under Rupi Legha MD.
Thank you. I meant to say that. I even made a note to myself. I was like, include all of her socials. Cool. Thanks, Rupi.
Sure.